One band, five voices, so many questions. This episode won't try to answer all of them, but it will give us a clear overview of where things stood at the height of NSYNC's career and at the start of what would become their final era. I'm your host, Nicole Raposo, and this is the first short and sweet episode of Unsynchronized, the deep dive podcast examining how NSYNC got out of sync and eventually called it quits. If season 1 of Unsynchronized is a full book, consider this the Cliff's Notes. It's a guided look at the shape of the year, the individual trajectories of each member, and the early signs of the shift that would eventually redefine the group's future. Let's get started. The first episode, From Puppets to Masters, set the stage in the year 2000, when NSYNC was at the height of their commercial power and cultural visibility. The group was everywhere, breaking records, expanding their brand, and navigating a rapidly shifting pop landscape that was already beginning to show signs of strain. Side projects were ongoing, but they functioned as extensions of the group's momentum rather than departures from it. At the same time, the industry and the media were subtly pushing narratives about solo careers and the eventual decline of the teen pop wave. This episode captured the tension between unprecedented success and the early indicators that the ecosystem around them was preparing for change. The key takeaways from episode 1 were, first, the industry was already eyeing solo careers. Even before the group made any moves, the media and the music industry were nudging things in that direction. During MTV's Grammy special, a reporter asked Lance Bass and Joey Fatone about solo plans for NSYNC, right after posing the same question to the Backstreet Boys. That kind of pressure planted the idea publicly, even though the guys were still framing their side projects, like Lance's management company or JC's songwriting, as part of the group's ecosystem. It seems the industry was ready to split them up before they were. Second, side projects were part of the group culture. Most members of NSYNC had something going on outside of the band, and that was normal. Like I mentioned, Lance had his talent management company. It was called Freelance Management, and he even did some acting on Seventh Heaven. JC Chazé wrote and produced songs for other groups, like Boys and Girls United. Chris Kirkpatrick continued growing his brand, Fu Manskito, and Justin had acted in a Disney movie called Model Behavior. These projects were ways for the members of the group to explore different facets of their creativity while still being fully committed to NSYNC. And at the time, nobody seemed to be penalized for having outside interests, at least not yet. The third takeaway is that they were hedging their bets, but hedging them together. The success of NSYNC wasn't treated like a forever thing. It was a peak moment, and they knew it might not last. That's where branding and merchandising deals came from, like their NSYNC and MSN internet deal, which was reported to be worth $20 to $30 million at the time. Executives called it a hedge against the impending teen pop twilight. So even though the group was still unified at that point, the business side of things was already treating them like a limited-time brand. Episode 1 gives us context for where everyone was by the end of 2000. The next 5 episodes follow each member individually through 2001, starting with Joey Fatone. In 3 Films and a Baby, we saw Joey Fatone juggling new fatherhood and new professional opportunities while still showing up for NSYNC as much as he could. His 2001 revealed what it looked like to be both a dependable member of the group and an artist testing the edge of his own interests. He navigated injuries, filming schedules, relentless touring, and nearly constant press with a mix of humor, candor, and fatigue. What stands out in hindsight isn't any single moment, but the pattern. Joey kept showing up, kept contributing, and kept framing every outside project as something that ultimately circled back to the group. Joey's episode gives us 3 critical takeaways. First, branching out doesn't mean not showing up. Joey was fully present and performed through every major moment for NSYNC, from the Video Music Awards to Challenge for the Children. Second, new opportunities meant variety, not replacement. In a press junket interview for On the Line, Joey described acting as a little vacation from music, but that didn't mean he was looking for an escape hatch. He also said everything comes back to NSYNC, and Joey consistently framed his individual pursuits as secondary to the group. Third, he framed the group's future as if it was aligned. Based on his public comments throughout 2001, Joey often spoke as if the group shared a mutual understanding about their timeline. Whether it was his hope for a continued future on Larry King Live, his remarks about needing rest, or his repeated references to touring in April 2002, he didn't present these things as ideas or personal guesses. He spoke as though they reflected a collective plan. His comments also highlighted two important questions: how a break that started in the fall and was described as lasting until a new tour in April shifted into touring in March, and also what time off really meant for NSYNC when the group still continued making public appearances and performing even during supposed downtime. Joey's year showed us what it looked like to balance personal milestones with public obligations. Chris's year was a balancing act too, but on a different scale. One that combined entrepreneurship with increased visibility and the growing weight of how the media chose to define him in that year. In The Buzzing Skeeto, we saw Chris Kirkpatrick navigate 2001 with a mix of humor, work ethic, and creative ambition. While the media increasingly used his age as shorthand for the end of teen pop, Chris himself remained steady, performing with the group, showing up at charity events, and expanding Fu Man Skeeto into a fully realized brand. His year wasn't defined by tension or distance from NSYNC. It was defined by growth. Chris found creative control outside of the group while still functioning inside of it as a reliable member, and also adapting to a shifting industry without stepping away from the collective. In this episode, there were 5 key takeaways for Chris. 1, his consistency was an anchor. He showed up for every performance, every appearance, and every group obligation. Nothing in his year suggested instability, and NSYNC still functioned as a unified whole. Number 2, his visibility outside of the group fit the era's norms. Chris's media moments, retail launches, and solo TV appearances weren't treated as threats. They were simply part of the broader NSYNC system within 2001. Number 3, his creative control lived outside of the group. Fu Man Skeeto gave Chris something that he rarely had within NSYNC, and that was creative authorship. Number 4, external narratives didn't match the internal reality. The media framed his age as symbolic of teen pop's decline, but inside the group and for the group, nothing was fracturing. They were still performing, still filming, still showing up together, and still having massive success with their new album. And then there's number 5. Chris saw the industry shifting, but without stepping away. He openly acknowledged the changing landscape, but the awareness didn't translate into conflict. He adapted and anticipated the group would be adapting too. While Chris spent 2001 balancing public visibility with media stereotyping, JC spent it balancing something quieter but heavier: the responsibility of shaping NSYNC's music at a moment where the industry was already looking for what came next. In the Behind the Boards episode, we saw JC Chasez navigating 2001 with a creative world that rarely translated into standout public visibility. When he was given space to talk about music, he was thoughtful and articulate, but those moments were limited. He didn't build a persona, didn't self-promote, and didn't engage with the media in ways that invited deeper coverage. As a result, his public image was shaped almost entirely by what others thought of him. At the same time, nothing in his year suggested distance from NSYNC. His side projects were small and compatible with the group's schedule. The girl group Wild Orchid was scheduled to release an album that contained a couple of songs that were written and produced by JC, but unfortunately that album was shelved. Another young pop group, Scene 23, had their debut album released coming off of the season finale of the WB program Pop Stars. JC had contributed music to that album too, though it didn't make much noise since Scene 23 was never among the most popular pop acts at the time. And then there were the several songs that JC contributed to the group's final studio album, Celebrity. Overall, JC's 2001 was defined by quiet loyalty, structural invisibility, and a creative identity that existed mostly out of public view. Looking back at this year, what do we learn about JC? I think there are 3 primary takeaways that we learned from this episode. First, that his creativity and his creative identity mostly existed behind the curtain. JC's interviews reveal someone with a very rich internal creative life, someone who's thoughtful, philosophical, and very precise about his craft. But because he didn't cultivate a public artist persona, the moments that he had to speak about his inner creative world were rare. His work for Scene 23 and Wild Orchid showed that he was writing, producing, and arranging outside of the group, but none of that translated into public visibility. The public heard his voice through NSYNC, but rarely saw the mind behind it. Second, his public image was shaped externally, not something that was self-defined. JC didn't project a media persona, and the press filled that vacuum however they wanted to, framing him as someone who was refined or maybe a little odd, sometimes with comments that were racially coded, or sometimes he was just simply invisible. But looking back, his invisibility wasn't just a media phenomenon. It also appeared within the group's own promotional ecosystem. In early materials for the Celebrity album, JC wasn't credited for one of the songs he wrote, and another song that he wrote may have been positioned as a single, but never received any meaningful U.S. promotion, and for some time, didn't seem to receive any meaningful promotion elsewhere in the world. It was only with later research that I found out that both songs did circulate in small ways internationally. The song Selfish appeared on a Brazilian telenovela soundtrack, and The Game Is Over was included as a bonus track on a European CD single. But these were peripheral releases that didn't change how invisible his contributions were within NSYNC's primary market or within their own promotional framework. These details raise questions about how his creative work was presented and how his visibility within the group's ecosystem intersected with the ways that the media framed him. The third thing we learned about JC in 2001 was that his actions pointed to loyalty, not departure. Nothing in 2001 suggests that JC was preparing to leave NSYNC. His outside projects were small and fully compatible with the group's schedule, and he repeatedly emphasized commitment in interviews. Publicly, he spoke about working on the Celebrity album harder and longer than any album we've ever made. And if Lance's memoir is accurate, JC's private reaction to Justin proposing an extended break, saying that it might be the beginning of the end, only makes sense if he expected the group to continue. The contrast between his public confidence and the concerns he may have expressed privately becomes an important thread as the timeline moves forward. While JC's creative world lived mostly behind the scenes, Lance's 2001 brought him into a new kind of public visibility. His production company and film work gave him a spotlight he rarely had within NSYNC itself. In part bass, part boss, Lance Bass's 2001 emerged as a year defined by competing obligations. On one side, he remained the steady, reliable member of NSYNC, navigating a recording schedule that bled into their supposed break and a demanding 3-month tour. On the other side, he was expanding as a businessman and an entertainer, running a talent management company, launching a film production company, and carrying the lead role in a major motion picture. The episode traces how he tried to honor all of it at once, even as the timelines began to collide, a collision that ultimately set the stage for the late-year conversation about taking a hiatus. For this year, I think there are 3 key takeaways for Lance. First, Lance was a team player who tried to follow the group's plan. In early 2001, Lance seemed to have a clear understanding of the schedule the group had publicly committed to. Record the album in January and February, and that meant he could film On the Line during the planned break in March. His entire year ended up being structured around that plan, and even when the album fell behind schedule, he stayed aligned with the group's needs and expectations. Second, even while promoting his biggest side project, Lance consistently emphasized that the music came first. Through the On the Line press cycle, including interviews where he discussed acting, producing, and script development, Lance said that he didn't see himself going solo and that NSYNC remained his priority. His film and production work fit into windows that he believed were designated breaks. And this was something in direct contrast to some of the other group members' side projects. Chris was running a promotional tour for Fu Manskito, and it directly overlapped with the group's Pop Odyssey tour. And I'm not saying that to throw shade, I'm just stating it as a matter of fact. Lance's side projects for the year were mostly structured in a way where they didn't compete too much with NSYNC obligations for his time and his focus. And the third takeaway is that Lance approached the group's future with optimism and good faith, which likely shaped how he interpreted the December conversation. When the idea of a 6-month break was floated to him, Lance recalls not seeing it as a threat because the group had taken other breaks before and had always returned to work. If the conversation unfolded the way Lance remembers, he likely didn't recognize the rhetorical escalation. The escalation from a simple break and a casual solo project to something that might take years to get right. His reaction reflects his belief that the group's structure was stable and that individual side projects could coexist with NSYNC's commitments. Lance approached 2001 with optimism and good faith, trusting that the group's structure would hold. Justin's 2001 shows what happens when one member's opportunities begin to reshape that structure from the inside. His episode is the turning point of the season, the moment when the full picture of NSYNC's year comes into focus. In episode 6, Turning the Page, we examined Justin Timberlake's trajectory through 2001. He started the year focused on the group's recording schedule and early promotional work, appearing regularly in press tied to the upcoming Pop Odyssey tour. Throughout the spring and summer, Justin remained at the forefront of the group's performances and media presence, appearing in multiple interviews and features that highlighted his role within the group. By the fall, the release of Gone placed him even more prominently in the group's musical output, with the song's arrangement and promotion centering his voice and his performance. He continued to appear in both group and solo press throughout the end of the year, including award shows, televised performances, and year-end features. December closed with the Billboard Music Awards, a holiday special, and the group conversation that preceded NSYNC's extended break in 2002. Overall, Justin's 2001 arc was marked by consistent public visibility, a growing creative presence within the group's work, and the year-long acceleration of his role as NSYNC's primary vocal and promotional focus. So, what can be said about Justin's 2001? Well, I think there are 4 takeaways. I think the first takeaway is that Justin had fewer external projects than most of the group, but his creative visibility inside NSYNC remained the highest. This was something that was largely cemented by the songs that he co-wrote for the Celebrity album, particularly the songs that ended up being chosen as singles. The second takeaway is that Justin's individual visibility expanded throughout 2001 in ways that were distinct from the rest of the group. All 5 members of NSYNC had side projects at different points in the year, but most of those still tied them back to the group, even when they or their projects were the focus of different media pieces. Over the course of the year, Justin started to have solo magazine covers, solo interviews, and solo branding opportunities that increasingly framed him as a standalone figure, despite the fact that his biggest project of the year was technically NSYNC's Celebrity album. The third takeaway is that Gone marked a structurally Justin-forward moment in the group's catalog and created a new level of exposure for him. The song's arrangement, the performances, and the promotional framing centered Justin in a way that had differed from any of the group's earlier singles. When Gone was released internationally, the CD single came out in multiple versions. Most international CD singles for Gone included at least one additional track that Justin co-wrote, whether that was another remix of Gone or a remix of Pop, or even that bonus track, I'll Be Good For You, which was a previously unreleased song from No Strings Attached. There was one documented European variant of the Gone single that included The Game Is Over as the bonus track, but the overall pattern still holds. Justin was the only member who consistently received publishing income from that single, and that gave him a unique commercial advantage with that single that none of the rest of NSYNC had at that time. As an additional note, Justin later said that Gone was the first time he had seriously considered going solo, claiming that he originally wrote the song as a duet for himself and Michael Jackson. When I say later, I mean over a decade later. He did not share this story publicly until after Michael Jackson's death, and no one else confirmed it or contradicted it. Because it couldn't be independently verified, it didn't clarify what he was thinking at the time in 2001, but it does show how he later reframed the significance of that song. The last takeaway from this episode is that Justin was the only member for whom external collaborators hinted at a solo future. And in one case, it wasn't just hinting, it seems that there was a direct discussion. Most of the group had worked with actors, writers, producers, business partners, songwriters, basically a wide variety of creatives outside of NSYNC throughout the course of 2001. But based on my research, none of those collaborators made comments suggesting that they were poised for solo careers. In contrast to that, you have Pharrell Williams telling Rolling Stone that Justin would show how soulful he was when it was time for him to do his solo. You also had Wayne Brady endorsing him to TV Guide as the one to watch when this NSYNC thing is over. And then, in December, you have Angie Stone, who later recalled that Justin approached her directly about being on his solo project. Her interview wasn't published until January, but the conversation she described likely took place during the 2001 calendar year, which would mean that Justin was soliciting features roughly 2 weeks before the private conversation that Lance remembered in his memoir. The conversation when Justin proposed an extended break and announced his intention to make a solo album. No comparable comments or conversations seem to exist for the other 4 members of NSYNC. Justin's episode closes the loop on individual timelines. Now that we know what each member actually managed in 2001, Episode 7 turns to the bigger question. How does that evidence hold up against the story the ET Canada article told nearly 2 decades later? Echoes versus Evidence was our first deep dive into the ET Canada article that originally sparked this entire project. We identified the voices behind the piece, including the writer herself, and examined their claims through the lens of the themes that have emerged throughout Season 1. Those themes included the group's burnout in 2001, the uneven communication patterns within the group, the different lanes and levels of leverage that each member had, and the external signals coming from collaborators and industry figures. Alex Gregg spoke from the limited vantage point of a producer and a collaborator, but his comments were positioned as if they reflected the full picture. In the ET Canada article, he says that he only heard about potential solo work after hearing that Lance wanted to go to space and take a year off. But he never says Lance told him this directly. His information came through second or possibly third-hand channels, but the article tried to make it sound authoritative. Barry Weiss offered what he called a bird's-eye view, but he did so while distancing himself from the power that he actually held at the time. He framed Justin's solo decision as something that emerged naturally during the downtime created by Lance's movie, while glossing over the fact that none of the resources Justin needed from Jive Records could have been approved without his direct consent as the president of the company. Joe Riccitelli contributed little more than vague platitudes about people growing up and outgrowing each other. His comments focused entirely on personal development and social positioning, while ignoring the contractual, logistical, and organizational realities of a multi-million-dollar global business with 5 equal partners. And the writer, Lena Taylor, used deliberate rhetorical choices that elevated these outside corporate voices while minimizing Lance Bass's perspective, even though he's the only member of NSYNC featured in the article and the only person whose comments actually aligned with the documented history of 2001. Lance's comments in the ET Canada article that deal with 2001, like his mention of the burnout the group was experiencing and his expectation for a short break, those things line up with the receipts that we've traced throughout this first season of Unsynchronized. While future seasons of the podcast will give us more points for comparison when it comes to the article, I think it's already becoming clear that the version of events presented in the article by Lena Taylor don't hold up against the historical record. So far, history simply isn't on the side of most of the men who participated in this piece or on the side of the woman who wrote it. So after all of this, what are today's major takeaways? I think the first takeaway is that the public narrative that's put forward in this article is a reconstruction, and it's polished, but it's not the historical reality. The explanations that get repeated in interviews and entertainment coverage are simplified, tidy, and likely curated for strategic reasons. They only brush up against what actually happened over the course of NSYNC's breakup. The real story, the one that's preserved in the historical receipts, is more complicated and less coordinated than what the sanitized versions suggest. The second takeaway? It's that the breakup didn't begin with a single decision or a single action. It emerged from a year of uneven dynamics that never lined up cleanly inside the group. Burnout, uneven communication, uneven leverage, uneven external signals, and uneven access to information likely all shaped how each member of NSYNC understood the same moment. And when you look at it that way, the so-called hiatus wasn't a unified choice so much as it was the point where all of those underlying dynamics finally converged. And the result was different people walking away with different interpretations of what their futures would look like. And the third takeaway for this episode is actually foundational to the rest of the podcast series. From this point forward, Unsynchronized will be operating with two parallel frameworks for understanding the so-called hiatus. There'll be the public logic and then the internal logic. And the work of this podcast is to try to be mindful of both and hold on to both at the same time. What that means going forward is that we'll be working with two separate logics. Like I said, there's the public logic, and that will be shaped by external signals, industry commentary, external pressures and actions, and essentially the logic that was front-facing and the way that the so-called hiatus was framed for the public. Then there's the internal logic, and that comes through the perspectives and the experiences of the 5 members of NSYNC who lived through the so-called hiatus. The rest of this series will be in part about understanding how those two logics developed, where they diverged, and what that divergence shows about NSYNC's breakup as it unfolded. That's where we'll end things for now. Thanks for joining me for the short and sweet version of Unsynchronized Season 1. You'll find links to the full YouTube episodes in the description, along with a list of other platforms where you can listen to the podcast. Season 2 launches on September 24th, and I hope you'll join me. If this short and sweet version helped you catch up, feel free to like the video or leave a comment. It really does help the channel. Until then, this is Nicole Raposo signing off. Remember, you can't spell unsynchronized without NSYNC.